We have the same call detail records that Nick Ballance used to create his draft report.
Yes, well, I believe so.
Do those records appear to come from the December 23rd, 2022 to AT&T warrants?
I would say primarily the second warrant from what I've reviewed.
And is that because the CAST draft report spans the full 6 months of those records?
That is correct.
Okay. And those records, did those come from the second AT&T search warrant?
That is also correct.
Can you tell anything about the tower report or how the tower information was used by Agent Nick Ballance?
The tower identifiers that are predominantly used, not exclusively, but predominantly used in the CAST draft report did not come from the report AU. If there's a conversion that can be made, and someone would have to have the national AT&T tower list, or at least the regional list. And I would take information from the CDRs. I would look at certain columns in this AT&T tower list, and I could get certain identifiers that are now being populated to the CAST report, if that makes sense.
Do we have a copy of the tower list that you believe was used?
We recently received 4 different versions. And when I say versions, they're just by month. And I believe we have August, September, November, and maybe December, or maybe it's in October. I'd have to go back and look. So far, I've only had time to look at the November. And from what I can tell, all of that appears to be accurate.
Would we need the October or the missing month to be able to do our work accurately?
It's a really good practice. I'm sure that's why the FBI included it. If I'm mapping records over a long period of time, like in this case, 6 months, I do want to see the different versions of the tower list to make sure that if a change was made within the network during that 6-month period, a tower I map in July may map differently in November. So it is important to have that data.
We have 4 of the 6 months, but not the other 2.
Correct. It would be helpful to even maybe see May, because there may not have been an update made in late June, early July. So May's would be what I would start with.
Can you tell if drive testing was done to create that CAST draft?
Yes, there's images in the latter part of the report up around slides 100 and above.
Somebody's doing drive testing. Do you expect data to be produced?
Absolutely. Creating a work product that uses drive testing and then coming into court and testifying without the drive testing is no different than creating an exhibit like this and then saying, well, we don't have to produce the AT&T records that created this. The source data for drive testing is the drive test.
Do we have the drive testing that was done by the FBI to help create that report?
We have what I believe is the majority. There are some significant pieces missing. I can't say that those missing pieces exist and haven't been turned over, or they were erroneously not collected. I don't know which, but there are some pretty significant pieces that are missing.
I'm going to ask you some questions about that. But first, I want to know when you first saw drive testing data that was produced to us in Discovery. What did that cover?
I found a file in the Discovery, I want to say early December, that included drive test, but it was about a 3-minute sample that covered less than a quarter of a mile in a completely irrelevant location. So it added no value to my analysis at all.
What were you looking for? What time frame and location were you looking for based on the CAST draft report review?
I would expect significant drive testing around any location that coverage maps were being used in the CAST report. I would expect significant documentation on potential routes that this device may have taken. I would expect significant documentation on the crime scene.
You just told us that you think we have most of it, but there's some significant parts that are missing.
Yeah, and I want to qualify that just so it's really clear, because I understand it's starting to get very technical. There's over 500,000 lines of data that was turned over. So I'll make it clear, there's a lot of data that has been produced. I would say, in my opinion, looking at what's been produced, probably 2 or 3% is missing. But it's not the amount of data or the time of the data, it's the locations of the data. Some of the most significant locations in this case, we're missing some data.
Those significant locations, have they been depicted or captured on the CAS draft report?
They have.
And tell me what those locations are. What are we missing?
I am unable to find any measurements along, I believe it's 270, the Moscow Pullman Road. If you drove the most direct route from Pullman to Moscow or vice versa, pretty much as soon as you're leaving Pullman to the time that you arrive in Moscow, we are missing that entire stretch. And if there's ever been a case that we need to look at, what does it look like when a phone travels from Pullman to Moscow? This is probably the case. We have the neighborhood around the crime scene, but we don't have the crime scene. From what I have reviewed, the FBI mapped 6% of the data that came in. Mallory's testimony and what I've seen through here, he was up to about 18%. So by either standard, more than 80% on both accounts were never mapped or accounted for. And I'm not talking overall from every single day for 6 months. I'm talking about the time frames that are chosen. So for example, this time period that's represented here is where I'm getting the 18%.
And that's the 48 hours.
This is specifically from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on the morning of the 13th, arguably the most critical time period of this entire investigation. They mapped a handful of connections. When I say a handful, they mapped 18%. When you add the other 82%, it tells a much more detailed story. When we put the drive test data on top of that, you can get even more refined.